Welcome back to Boilers and Beyond. I'm Jordan Jones. The early signing period is underway, and Purdue saw 12 players sign their letters of intent on Wednesday. How does the class look? How do these guys project as future Boilermakers? We'll get to all of that related to signing day and football recruiting here on the show today. Plus, the Zach Edey-less basketball team took down New Orleans last night to move to 12-0. As Purdue prepares to head into the new year with a 0 in the loss column. How do things look? Where are they currently? Lots of basketball to get to as well today, plus a few of your questions. Looking forward to this one. If you don't already, be sure to follow along on Twitter, @BoilersBeyond. Lots to get to there, lots of basketball games to talk about, and plenty of moving parts with the football roster, with the football coaching staff. You'll want to follow along there to join the conversation. And be sure to subscribe. After Christmas, I'll have a full preview episode getting you all ready for the Citrus Bowl. So be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss that. And so much to come as we get into the heart of Big Ten basketball season after the new year. Wanted to start, though, with National Signing Day. One of my favorite days of the year. Football recruiting is always just so fascinating, just from a nationwide perspective and also from a local perspective with Purdue. You know, this class isn't guaranteed to be done yet. And Ryan Walters really insinuated that when he released his statement on signing day where, you know, he expressed obviously that he's excited for the guys they have committed and signed now, but also, you know, looking to continue into February with the normal signing day. I guess what used to be the normal signing day. But to get into February and look at what Purdue can sign there, what they can add to this class, as well as what they will add to via the transfer portal. So this is just the beginning of what Purdue is going to add here ahead of the 2023 season. But look, this class inherently has some challenges when you undergo a coaching change, 2.5 weeks before the early signing day? It's not easy. And Purdue saw a number of players decommit. I think that number is at 7 right now. If you're Purdue, you know, you hope that's where it ends. But, you know, losing 7 players is pretty difficult. It's not something you really want, but to some degree it's inevitable. And you can't really blame any of the young men who decommitted. It's tough. You know, coaching changes are tough. You sign up to play with one coaching staff, and that extends far beyond just Jeff Brom. A lot of position coaches have moved on. Those that didn't follow him to Louisville, you know, their standing with the program still is very much in question as they, you know, look to a new staff and see if Ryan Walters brings in his own guys. I'm sure he will. So you can understand that. Purdue signed 12 players on Wednesday. I got 12 guys with their letter of intents in. 11 were committed beforehand, and they got a surprise. Currently sits as the 13th ranked class in the Big Ten. Obviously, it's small. If you look at the average player rating, I use 24/7 Sports for all the recruiting information that I talk about on the podcast. If you look at the average player rating, Purdue is certainly higher than 13th. So it reflects a better quality of players that Purdue's bringing in. But of course, it is a smaller quantity. And when you look at how these team rankings are developed, you know, that's a part of it. It's inevitably a part of it. When you look at Purdue just having 12 guys signed, it's going to be smaller. They'll add more before February, I think. That's something that Purdue really hasn't seen much in the last couple years. Since the early signing period came into play, the vast majority of Purdue's signings have taken place in December. Ryan Walters sounds like he's going to try to add a couple guys before then. I think, you know, that's clearly a good idea. You want to maximize what you can bring in out of the high school ranks. I don't think a small class is the end of the world. You know, I talked about this on our last podcast where 10 years ago, a small class like this really put you behind the eight ball. Even going back 5 years, a small class like this is a problem. But in the modern college football world, you can fill scholarships so easily through the portal to get to that 85 number. You can bank some. You can get to 80, but roll over 5 scholarships to the 2024 class where you can, you're no longer limited by the 25 new qualifier rule. Now you can add as many as you would like. So a small class is just a small class. That's all it is. I certainly expect Purdue to go heavy through the portal. I think they have to put together a bowl caliber roster in 2023. But, they can't rely solely on the portal. And you have to develop high school players. You have to build a high school pipeline. You have to develop within to get that type of talent to compete. You have to build that depth. Guys in the portal typically don't jump places to be depth pieces. It happens, guys either think they're going to play more than they do or maybe get bad information. But in general, you're not going to build depth through the portal. High school is really important. And that's why, looking at this class, some of these players are really good pickups. I look at the trio of defensive guys, Will Helt, Winston Berglund, and Dylan Thieneman. A trio of guys out of the North Indianapolis area, Helt and Berglund from Carmel, Thieneman from Westfield. These are guys who you need to get. Guys who are, mid to high 3-star recruits from your backyard, from Indianapolis, just an hour down the road. They're good pickups. I think Will Helt especially has some real potential kind of at that outside linebacker defensive end spot. But holding on to those guys is really important. Carmel especially with Helt and Berglund, Thieneman you have some advantages with. Obviously, he's the younger brother of Dylan and Jacob and Brennan Thieneman. He is Dylan. But you have some advantages there. You probably weren't too worried about him flipping. But with Helt and Berglund, Carmel's an area that Purdue has not always had great success recruiting. Mark Hagan obviously helped bridge that gap, but keeping those guys committed, excellent. We'll see if they're instant impact guys. I doubt it. I think Helt of those 3 is probably the most ready, but he jumps to a position where Purdue's pretty solid right now. I don't know that they're instant impact guys, but they're good guys to get, and they're guys who I think project well for your program. I think the same about Jerron Tibbs, a 6'4" receiver out of Cathedral, a guy who really intrigues me because of that height and because of his athleticism. Tibbs is a guy who plays basketball. He started for Cathedral on their state championship basketball team last year. Not the best player on the team. A couple of D1 guys in Tayshawn Comer and Xavier Booker kind of overshadowed him. But a guy who has that type of athleticism, that projects really nicely to when he's focused on football only. I think it's awesome that he plays basketball. That's great for his overall athleticism and development. But once he's focused solely on football, I think a lot of those traits that make him a good basketball player will come out and be shown on the football field. Zion Gunn was a guy who really came out of nowhere when he committed. There wasn't a lot of information about him out there. He wasn't someone who was a natural Purdue guy coming out of Florida, but, he's a 6'2", 6'3" corner. That alone brings some intrigue. What can he do there? We don't know much about him, but if he can develop into that big disruptive corner, playing, maybe the short side of the field, I think that's really interesting. Him and Ethan Cole, the 2 corner commits in this class, are going to be important guys because when you look at how Ryan Walters wants to play his defense, you need those corners who can play one-on-one coverage, man coverage, and do a nice job. That's the way Walters likes his defense to play, and he asks a lot out of his corners. Those guys are going to have to develop into good pieces for him, but I think, especially with Gunn's size, a lot of intrigue there. I really had forgotten about Jimmy Liston, a guy who committed in the 2022 class, but went down to IMG, played a prep year, originally from Chicago. He's the only offensive line signee that Purdue got. They had another decommit in Ethan Fields, but Liston's a guy, Purdue legacy, will play on the interior. I believe he's supposed to be a center. So, a good pickup there. Good to get him on board. A post-grad year probably helped develop him a little bit, so Purdue gets a little bit more of a finished product, you hope. And then the one surprise that Purdue got on signing day was Jamarion Harkless, a big defensive tackle, 6'3", 315. Been committed a couple different places, had a pre-existing relationship with Walters. He was an Illinois commit at one time, and then he moved on to commit to Auburn once Hugh Freeze took over. Not a fit there, so he moves on and he comes to Purdue. And you have to be very happy with picking him up because he's a guy who really fits, again, what Ryan Walters wants to do on defense. You need those big defensive linemen to stop the run. Those big interior defensive linemen, he had them at Illinois. That was a really key part of that defense this year. And now Harkless projects as a guy who can do that at Purdue. The two guys who are committed and did not sign, Kendrick Gilbert, the big four-star recruit out of Cathedral, defensive end, and George Burhan, tight end out of New Palestine. Is he from New Palestine? Mount Vernon? Mount Vernon, I think. Sorry about that. From Mount Vernon. Those guys, we'll see what happens there. Burhan did visit Louisville, but I've heard that he may sign during this early period still. We'll see what goes on there. Gilbert sounds like he won't sign until February. Purdue's going to have its hands full there. Kentucky was the main competitor to get him initially. Kentucky, when you're in the SEC, you don't stop recruiting a guy once he's committed. They're very good about being persistent. I am sure, it's a school that has a good NIL setup. Can they lure him down to Lexington? I don't know. But it probably isn't the worst thing for Purdue that you have a defensive-minded head coach, that you have a good foundation of defense to pitch to him. We'll see what goes on there with those two, but, as a whole, I think you got to be okay with what Purdue landed on early signing day and with what Purdue can do here, a couple more months to get a couple high school players added, but especially the transfer portal, where Purdue lost two bigger names this week. Branson Dean and Lawrence Johnson are both going to enter the transfer portal. This is really the second and third big loss for Purdue. These guys obviously joining Spencer Holstedge. We saw this week that Holstedge is going out to UCLA. We'll see where Dean and Johnson end up. They are going to play in the bowl game, which is rather interesting. Not something you always see, but if you're Purdue, you'll take it. You need everything you can get against LSU. That game's going to be an uphill battle regardless. So you'll take them. Guys who battled some injuries at times this year, especially Branson Dean missing the Northwestern and IU game late. It's not impossible that they end up back at Purdue. Anything is possible when it comes to the transfer portal. You don't want to assume much. I would doubt it. I don't think they will stay at Purdue, but I've heard of crazier things. These guys both have 1 year of eligibility left. It's their COVID year. So if you're Purdue, you didn't really expect them back necessarily. You never know how these internal roster dynamics go with this COVID year. I don't know what to make of it. It's not been good for the sport as a whole, but my God, did it make the world of difference this year for Purdue. This team without Aiden O'Connell and Charlie Jones, they might have gone like 3-9. It would have been a major, major world of difference. So you'll take the COVID year. Whether these guys use it at Purdue or not, it doesn't sound like it. I thought Branson Dean may throw a shot at the NFL. I don't know. We'll see where these guys end up. I think certainly, looking for the best NIL opportunity. I can't blame them if that's the case. Some guys who are going to slide in on that defensive interior to replace them. A name I kind of forgot about, DeMar-J Lewis. Got hurt, missed all of the season, got hurt early on in fall camp. He'll be back next year. A guy who, was coming into the season, was Purdue's number 3 guy on the interior behind Johnson and Dean. He's a guy who, certainly if he's back to 100% healthy, he'll start there. Prince Boyd, Cole Brevard, Suleiman Kapaka, those guys all got some reps on the interior this year. Moa Monade as well. Those guys all kind of project in that area next year. Purdue's still going to be deep on the defensive front. It's going to be interesting to see how Purdue lines up there, though. You're going to have a new scheme. Ryan Walters doesn't like to call it a 3-4 because he does some interesting things. He'll bring 5 up front. He's got a lot of looks he'll throw at you. So that much is interesting. We'll see what all this looks like. But losing those two, certainly a big loss, but you do have to be thankful that they're going to stick around and play in the bowl. On the flip side of COVID year decisions, Cam Allen is going to return to Purdue in 2023 on Tuesday. He told the media that he will use his 5th year of eligibility and play at Purdue. Look, very welcome news. Cam Allen certainly didn't have his best season in 2022, but the secondary is going to be awfully thin next year. Whether Reese Taylor or Jamari Brown use a COVID year, I don't know, but Purdue's going to lose Corey Trice. Purdue's going to lose Bryce Hampton. I would expect, that Taylor and Brown move on. Just, again, you don't know how these COVID years really work, but, if they move on, this is going to be really thin. This is going to be a really thin group. Allen and Sanusi Kane, they're going to form a nice safety pairing with some experience, with some upside. I think that's a good foundation for that secondary. Very welcome news to get Cam Allen back. All right, getting into basketball here. This is probably the last time we will talk about basketball before the new year. Next episode is going to be a Citrus Bowl preview, and then we'll probably be back after the new year. So, Purdue beat up on New Orleans last night, won by 21, a game that Purdue got out of the gate a little bit slow, had a big run that put the game away. I think it was probably a positive that Purdue had to play a game without Zach Edey. It didn't make the New Orleans game pretty. It didn't make it all that fun, but it's probably a good thing. Purdue really hasn't had to play without him at all this season. He's playing 30 minutes a game, more than that. He's really avoided foul trouble well. Purdue hasn't had to deal with him, picking up 2 fouls early on at all this year. So that it's probably good that Purdue had to experience that. Trey Kaufman-Renn really took advantage. He had a career night, 24 points on 8 of 10 shooting. He was awesome. He's a really good player. He's not getting a ton of minutes for Purdue because of Zach Edey's presence, but Trey Kaufman-Renn projects really nicely as that low post scorer. He's far more skilled in the low post than I would have expected for a redshirt freshman who, isn't 7 feet tall. He does some awesome things down there, and it was good to see him knock down 8 out of his 10 free throws. He hasn't looked comfortable at the line sometimes this year, but he did on Wednesday night against New Orleans. That's really all there is to say about this game, I think. Mason Gillis played well, played really hard. Braden Smith had, a 4-minute stretch where he just absolutely took the game over. It's no coincidence that was a part of Purdue's 24-2 run. Not much to say. Zach Edey should be back. He just was dealing with an illness, so not a long-term deal there. Next up, Purdue finishes out non-conference. They play Florida A&M. That's next Thursday, the 29th. Look, Florida A&M's winless against D1 competition. They're one of the worst teams in the country on KenPom. They're worse than New Orleans, who was horrible. Purdue should have no problem with the Rattlers. So Purdue projects to go 13-0 into the new year. It'd be the first time going undefeated into the new year since the 2009-2010 season. That was Robbie Hummel and company's junior year, Chris Kramer's senior year. Purdue got up to number 4, I think, before a couple of early Big Ten losses. Who could have seen this coming? It's just unbelievable that this team is sitting at number 1. Will, I presume, be number 1 for another week on Monday when the new AP poll comes out. And then they get Florida A&M and should take care of that and stay number 1. Crazy stuff here. Just remarkable first 2 months to this season for Purdue. A couple thoughts here as Purdue moves into the new year, moves into Big Ten play. The minutes crunch at the 4 is going to be really interesting to watch, because if Zach Edey is playing 30-plus minutes a game, there really aren't many minutes for Caleb Furst at the 5. Now, we know that, Trey Kaufman-Renn and Caleb Furst playing together is interesting because, Furst plays more out, Kaufman plays more in, but, when Zach Edey's out of the game, Caleb Furst will be your tallest guy out there. How about that? And then you have Trey Kaufman-Renn and Mason Gillis kind of at that 4 spot, along with Caleb Furst, who's been starting there recently. How that minute distribution is going to work is going to be really interesting, because these guys all bring tremendous value. You look at what Caleb Furst has done recently, his activity. Even against New Orleans, when he got into some foul trouble, he was incredibly active on the offensive glass. He's been great at diving to the rim, getting open looks right around the basket just from playing hard. We know he's capable of knocking down some threes. He's a strong defender, a nice athlete there. He brings a lot of value. Mason Gillis is your consummate professional type guy. Goes out there, plays hard, doesn't make mistakes. While he's not shooting the ball particularly well right now, I think we have enough data to know that he is a capable three-point shooter. He's never going to be a guy that, you're not running stuff for him the way you do Fletcher Lawyer or the way you did Ryan Klein or Sasha Stefanovic or Dakota Mathias, but, you still need to get him open looks from 3, good rebounder. He brings value. Trey Kaufman-Renn, a really good low post scorer. Someone who you can throw the ball to inside and he can go get a bucket. So, how that minute distribution works. Look, you can only play 200 minutes in a game, and there are only 80 minutes at the 4 and 5 combined, and 30 of those are going to Zach Edey. How the rest works out, I don't know, but that's going to be fascinating to see. You don't want to continue to harp on this unnecessarily, but how good of a shooting team really is Purdue? I think it's starting to become a little bit of a concern after another game where they did not shoot very well against New Orleans. Purdue's shooting just 31.1% from 3 on the season right now. We saw this defensive approach from Davidson, from Nebraska, where they were able to force the ball out of Zach Edey's hands a lot. You can't do that if Purdue's burying threes on you, but when they're missing, you absolutely can. That's got to get better for Purdue. And they have capable shooters. I mean, we know Braden Smith's a good three-point shooter. He's low volume, but he's shot well. Fletcher Lawyer is a very high-volume three-point shooter. He really hasn't gotten going yet, but we know he can absolutely shoot it. Same deal with Brandon Newman. He's not shooting particularly great from 3 on the season, but we know what he's capable of there. Caleb Furst, Mason Gillis, Ethan Morton, more low-volume three-point shooter guys who you know can do it. And that's David Jenkins, has been a good three-point shooter throughout his career. But right now, they're not falling for Purdue. And there have been games where Purdue has not shot well from three. Austin Peay was just brutal. Florida State, Purdue didn't shoot great from three. Nebraska, Davidson, now New Orleans. These are starting to add up. So you don't want to make too much out of nothing. You don't want to overblow it. But Purdue's got to start knocking down three-pointers at a higher clip. And it's obvious to say, anyone who... Now, you don't have to know much about basketball to realize it. But we'll see if Purdue can start knocking that down. Because if teams try to take away Zach Edey early, and Fletcher Lawyer or, Ethan Morton or Mason Gillis, whoever, can knock down 2 or 3 quick threes, that changes things. That changes the dynamic real quick. I'll never forget a game, 2017-18 season. That's what Wisconsin tried to do to Isaac Haas in a game at Purdue. I don't remember what the score was, but Purdue drilled like 7 or 8 threes right away. It was something like 24-4, and the game was absolutely over. If Purdue can do that to teams, you take away that ability to just hound Zach Edey and force the ball out of his hands. I think the bench is really important too. Right now, you look at Purdue, the top scorers are Zach Edey, Fletcher Lawyer, Braden Smith. Those guys are absolutely critical to have on the floor. Those guys, Zach Edey's the best player in the country right now. Fletcher Lawyer is your best off-ball guard. And Braden Smith is just such a difference maker at point guard. You see the difference when he's on the floor and when he's not. It's very clear. Come the big games, he's going to be playing more than 30 minutes all the time. Outside of them, who's going to get you some scoring? Caleb First is doing a nice job of picking up the baskets that come to him. Trey Kaufman-Renn can go get a bucket. But I look at the bench, Brandon Newman and David Jenkins Jr. are going to be pretty important here. When you look at Purdue's guards, Ethan Morton's not out there to be a scorer. He's your best defender. He can knock down open threes when they come. He's not shot great so far. Again, just like Brandon Newman, just like Fletcher Lawyer, we know he's a better shooter than his numbers indicate. But these bench guards need to score, and they need to do so fairly efficiently. That's not an easy thing to ask. A guy like Jenkins, particularly, who has been kind of the featured scorer everywhere he's been, asking him to play a real complementary role, that's a tough ask. Brandon Newman, a guy who... he's had quite the roller coaster here. He had a good game last night against New Orleans. Purdue needs him to just play smart, to just play within himself, knock down the shots that are there for him. Purdue's bench needs to be solid. It was that game against Davidson when Purdue scored 1 bench point. That can't happen. You can't ask that much out of Zach Edey, out of Braden Smith, out of Fletcher Lawyer. Elsewhere, Purdue has to get some help. I think they will, but I think monitoring that bench is going to be really important. Had a couple of really good questions here. Just 2 questions from the mailbag, but they're both really high quality stuff. I'll start with the basketball one, and a narrative that is really starting to get thrown around throughout Purdue fans. Why/if will March be different this year since December isn't? I'll push back on this notion that December isn't different for a couple of reasons here. Number one's the obvious one. Purdue hasn't lost yet. That's a key difference. Purdue got to number 1 last year and then lost at Rutgers. And then after that, they played in as ugly of a win as you could ever hope for against NC State. That game made Nebraska and Davidson look like beautiful wins for Purdue. I think finding a way to win is really important here. They did so on the road. That Rutgers game last year was their first true road game. Purdue found a way to win in its second true road game against Nebraska in, like that Rutgers game, an environment that was pretty charged up. I think also looking at it, Purdue, even though they have missed threes a lot, you aren't seeing the crazy existential crisis of turnovers and defensive problems that we saw reveal themselves in December last year. It was that game. Who on earth did they play? Now it can't come to me. It was right before the bowl game. It was all Purdue people in Nashville watching it. Was it Nicholls State? Purdue won like 102-90 in a game where Purdue had absolutely zero business giving up 90 points. And that was a red flag of all red flags. And it came to kill them in the next game when Johnny Davis had like 38 on him in Mackey Arena, and Wisconsin beat them and put Purdue behind the 8 ball in the Big Ten race. The defense has been a lot better. Purdue's opponents are averaging less than 1 point per possession in the last few games. That's a big, big sign. Purdue didn't do that last year. Purdue's not turning the ball over at such an alarming rate like they did at times last year in December. I just think the problems are a little bit less worrisome and a little bit less existential crisis than what we saw last December. I think this year's team is a lot more emotionally mature than last year's group was. It's a much more cohesive group. I think they approach the game with a much more business-like mentality. There's a lack of dancing. There's a lack of massive celebrations that we saw from last year's team that I think just present a much more focused, a much more competitive team this year. I think this team just has more of a killer instinct than last year's did. I think they're more competitive guys. Now, these 2 points of maturity and competitiveness, they come with the caveat of this. You don't have a Jaden Ivey, who was a top 10 NBA pick, who was an All-American. You don't have a Travion Williams, who was a first-team All-Big Ten guy in his career, who I think was an honorable mention All-American as a junior. You don't have that. You have Zach Edey, but you don't have those type of guys. Last year's team had more sheer talent. But I think having that singular go-to guy in Zach Edey can be a good thing. You don't have to balance who is the go-to guy, who gets the looks. I think just as a whole, the average game for this year's team is a lot more sustainable. Last year's team probably had a higher ceiling, but I think they had a lower floor, and volatility can be a really good thing and it can be a really bad thing. You look at North Carolina, who had a really high range of outcomes, get to the national championship game. But you look at those teams who are quite volatile, and they're the teams that lose in the first round not every year, but those are the types of teams that get upset. So, whether March will be different or not, I don't know. Purdue has still made 4 Sweet 16s in the last 5 tournament appearances. Last year was the ultimate disappointment, but I don't know whether March will be different or not. At least try to enjoy what's going on right now, though. Again, no one would have ever considered that this team would be number 1, that they'd be 12-0 and top ranked in the country on Christmas. No one thought they were going to beat Duke. No one thought they were going to beat Gonzaga. I didn't know if they would beat Marquette or Florida State. They did all that. They're the favorite right now to win the Big Ten. Not that that means anything with 18 conference games to go, but they're in a place that no one really saw coming. I know this is the most Final Four hungry fan base in America. Purdue fans are starved for it, and rightfully so. They should be. It makes no sense that this program hasn't made a Final Four in 42 years, but try to enjoy the process. Try to enjoy what's in front of you right now, because it could be so much worse. It could be a lot worse. Had a great football question as well. What should expectations be for Purdue under Ryan Walters for recruiting class rankings going forward? And then, would a top 30 class next year be a massive success? And I'll start by answering the second question. Yeah, absolutely. A top 30 class would be massive. Purdue's done that just once since Joe Tiller left. I was looking back at 24/7 rankings. Purdue had a top 30 class in 2019. That was, a big-time class. That was George Karlaftis, David Bell, Milton Wright, Marvin Grant. Before that, though, I think you were going back to like 04, 05, 03, that range where Joe Tiller was recruiting quite well, but, those players were a little bit sketchy off the field, had some issues internally at the program at that time. But look, a top 30 class would be remarkable. You look at it, recruiting rankings absolutely matter. And with that 2019 class, that was as productive as we've seen. All four of those four-star guys were really impactful. Jalen Graham has been remarkably impactful. King Daru has had a nice impact at Purdue. That class was awesome. Spencer Holstead was in that group. He was a great offensive lineman for Purdue. I don't know that I would expect a top 30 class next year, but that would be huge. That would be absolutely welcomed. I think a reasonable expectation here is that middle of the pack of the Big Ten, in that 6 to 10 range, just looking at the conference team rankings before USC and UCLA join. Obviously, those two programs are going to have higher recruiting ceilings than Purdue, but beating out the programs that you compete with. Even this year, Purdue lost a number of commits. They still finished higher than Indiana. That's a good thing. You want to compete with Illinois. You want to be higher than Northwestern. You want to look at, can you compete with the Iowas, Wisconsins, Minnesotas? That's all important. Even when the divisions go away, those are still the programs you're going to measure yourself against. I don't know what NIL looks like here in terms of middle of the pack Big Ten recruiting classes, but you're going to need a solid NIL approach. To recruit at a high level, you're going to need to at least have an NIL that moves the needle. Whether Purdue has that or not, I have no clue. We haven't really seen Purdue try to go buy players, but I've said this before and I'll say it again, April is going to be the test of what Purdue's NIL approach looks like when it comes to getting Zach Edey back for another year. We will know a lot more when that comes to be time. I think looking at, just in general, to answer this question holistically, looking at how Purdue handles the balance of high school recruiting and transfer portal recruiting will play a big role here. Time will tell how Ryan Walters approaches that balance. If you take the approach of getting a little bit smaller of a high school class, it's going to hurt your overall team ranking. Quantity matters quite a bit there. But if you go a little bit more high school heavy, which I think you still need to do, bring in good high school classes, then yeah, I think getting to that middle of the pack of the Big Ten is a reasonable expectation for what Ryan Walters does on the recruiting trail at Purdue. You want to bring in that high-end talent. Bringing in, the big names from Indiana, like Bell and Karlaftis, bringing in a high-profile quarterback, guys at impactful positions. Very, very important. I wanted to wish you all a Merry Christmas. It's the 22nd here as I record. Merry Christmas to all of you. Wish you all a wonderful holiday with your family. And be safe to all of you across the Midwest. It looks like this evening here we're going to start getting hit with some snow. Going to be cold, incredibly windy. Please stay safe. Enjoy your holiday season. Thank you to all of you who are listening here to this show today ahead of the holidays or after the holidays with travel. I appreciate you all so much. We will be back with one more show before the new year. It'll be a Citrus Bowl preview. I will have it pre-recorded. I think I'll record that on the morning of the 24th and then post that on the 26th or 27th. Just get it out for you all to listen to throughout that week between the holidays. I'll be traveling, so won't have a show till after the new year. Thank you guys so much for listening, for supporting. Follow along on Twitter. Come join the conversation at Boilers Beyond. Be sure to subscribe. Please stay safe, everybody, and I will talk to you after Christmas. Have a wonderful holiday to all of you.